Why don't we get started? Great. So my name is Lus Mendel, they, them. I'm the Director of Developer Relations at Carat, which is a company that specializes in technical interviews. And what I'm going to cover today are 4 uncommon but significant interview best practices. These are things that I don't see people necessarily talking about, but I think they can have a really big impact. And the theme of this talk really is all about how conversations change lives, people change lives. In order to hire good people, you need good hiring people, which my marketing team thought would sound better with a better name like interview engineer, which means engineers who interview other engineers. So that's what I'll largely be talking about. And to give you some context before I dig in, so at Carat, we specialize in technical interviewing. We do interviews. We have a bunch of interview engineers. I actually started at Carat as one. And we make, our mission is to make every interview predictive, fair, and enjoyable. And so hopefully these 4 best practices are really going to help you do these 3 things. And the way we work is that we don't source candidates. We leave that up to sourcing and recruiting experts. And so our clients are tech companies that come to us with candidates. We do those interviews, technical interviews, and then share our observations and recommendations back with the hiring managers and recruiters to decide next steps. We've done over 60,000 interviews, and that's a lot of data. We also integrate with the applicant tracking systems of our clients, so we can monitor the whole pipeline and really look at what the weak spots are, and do a lot of analysis on the quality of different sources, and there's a lot of data analysis. For my part, I'm more on the, we'll get into where I sit later, but it's more in the interviewing and research component, and we can really monitor interviewer, like how interviewers are doing, consistency, those sorts of things. The question calibration, the quality of our questions, stuff like that. So I'm going to go through these best practices with some real-world examples that I learned the hard way. So I started my computer science career at MIT in the US, Cambridge, that side of the Atlantic. I have a bachelor's of computer science and then a master's of engineering, but before I was on top of the world, I really struggled my first 2 years at school. I was a terrible student, failing most of my classes, really wondering, am I even gonna become a programmer? And luckily for me, I took this class that changed everything, 6170, this required software engineering lab. It was a wonderful experience for me. Here's the professor, Professor Jackson, giving a TED talk on Therac 25 and how important it is to design software well so that it doesn't kill people. The class was very great. Every week we'd complete some assignment and then we'd hand it in to our TA. This was all standard back then. But what was really cool was that after every assignment, we'd get 15 minutes to talk one-on-one with a teaching assistant, or TA. And they would ask us to talk about why we made those design decisions and explain different parts of the code, and they'd give us feedback and encouragement. And I think because of those personable conversations, it changed everything for me. Those conversations changed my whole outlook, and I ended up doing really well in the class. Maybe not best in class, but I got an A+. I took all of Professor Jackson's future classes. I became a TA for this class. I ended up doing my master's of engineering with Professor Jackson. So it really turned things around for me. And I just wanted to set up how conversations can really have a big impact on our careers and our trajectories. And interviews are really part of our careers. And so I think they're very important. So that success from MIT, I sort of launched a really wonderful career for me, and I worked at some startups in DECA, which was acquired by Oracle. I started a couple startups. I worked at Microsoft Research and the MIT Media Lab. And in 2010, I was fortunate enough to join this 10-person tiny startup called CloudKick. It was a Y Combinator company. And shortly thereafter, they were acquired by a large public company. So I sold out and went corporate. This headshot with my knuckle tattoos and a ripped shirt was actually taken a couple weeks ago, but I heard developers in London dress a lot nicer. So how am I doing? So it was Rackspace, a large company in Texas. And so this was a great opportunity for me because I was at this tiny 10-person company. We were now in charge of growing this company to like 120 people. We did that in 3 years. It was a lot of hiring. So I learned a lot of professional skills I didn't have before of all these startups, like the importance of doing testing and continuous integration and so forth. Hey, what's a code review and why should we do those? And more relevant for this talk, interview reviews, which are actually similar to code reviews. This is where, at Rackspace, for example, 2 interviewers would interview every candidate. And then one of the nice qualities, there's many nice qualities of this, I think, but one nice quality is that after the interview, the 2 interviewers can have a short, like 5-minute retrospection or reflection on how the interview went. Don't talk about the candidates, do your evaluation separately, and then maybe compare if those are consistent. But right after, you can have a chat and say, hey, did we give the candidate enough time to think? Did we ask the right questions? How do you think it went? So it's a great, just like with code review, we do that to improve the, so with code review, we do it to improve the code base quality and to share knowledge. You do the same thing with interviews, right? Engineering practices, they can be applied here. So at Carat, we've really formalized this process. All of our interviews are recorded. So they're remote interviews using our platform, which has a video component, a shared coding environment. They're happening 24/7 whenever it's convenient for candidates. The candidates know they're being recorded to share with the hiring companies. And so we can have this review for the same reason, interview quality, to align interviewers. And these conversations, I think they do change lives, not just for candidates. And just, candidates don't want some mistaken error to impact this really high stakes decision that's happening. And also it's a great way for interviewers to feel connected and feel a sense of community and growth. Okay, so the second thing that I'd like to impart on you all is the importance of setting interviewers up to succeed. So before I learned all of these wonderful best practices at Rackspace, well, let me just say this. Has anyone here ever destroyed all the user data? Thank you, I'm glad it's not just me. Yes, you too? Great, failure? Yes, it happens to all of us. We're human, our tiny human minds, they make mistakes. And this almost happened to me. I committed to the Git master branch to production, a drop all tables. I was trying to helpfully, in my first week at CloudKick, help someone, a coworker, his database was in a funny state. I was like, I know what to do. I'll just drop all the tables, load in some dev data just for you. I committed it so that, he can, way better than a USB stick, right? Got on a plane to fly back to Boston, had a very relaxing flight. Luckily, I didn't actually affect production. I had a coworker who reviewed my code and was like, that looks funny. And I was mortified. I was like, oh my gosh, they're gonna fire me like 4 days after I started. And he was like, no, it's all of our bads. It's the system. The system set you up to fail, but like we got you, right? That's kind of a mantra in engineering. We're all gonna make mistakes. How can we set people up to succeed? So what does this look like in interviewing? Because the same thing can happen, right? Like, you're an engineer, you're trying to get this feature out the door, there's this thing on your calendar, you're like flustered, you're like, I don't even know what question I'm supposed to ask. Is that person like a bad interviewer? I mean, maybe they're just not being set up to succeed, right? And the way you can tell if this is happening is if you come to an on-site debrief, like, various interviews have happened during the day and now you all have to come together and give your feedback and decide whether you're gonna hire this person. That may or may not be happening at your company, but it's a common thing. And if you are doing that kind of thing, or doing interviewer reviews perhaps, if you notice confusion, and someone's like, wait, was this a junior or a senior role? Or wait, you asked that question, but no one asked, this is a cloud computing position. How come no one asked about distributed systems or something? If you have any kind of confusion, that's the signal that there's a problem, that there might be better ways to set interviewers up to succeed. Is this something you all have encountered? Yeah. I mean, it's like as interviewers, we have one job, right? It's to know at the end of the interview, yes or no. Do I want to move this person forward based on what I've experienced? And then so many times I'm like, maybe? Is that an answer? Not a great answer. So at Rackspace, one of the things that we decided to do on this point was to make the hiring manager responsible for 4 things. First, at the beginning of the day, they'd have a morning sync to get everyone on the same page about the goals of the role and what we're trying to hire for. And they'd assign for every interview pair, okay, you're gonna do this topic and these questions, so everyone knew what they were doing. And then after all the interviews, we'd have this debrief with a whiteboard, pros and cons. Everyone would go around to list what they thought about the candidate. We kind of had this whole process, and then there's this decision-making process. In our case, hiring manager is a person with authority who makes a decision with input, and there's a whole voting scheme, and no's are weighted more than yeses. Everyone does it a little different, but it's nice to be thoughtful about it. If you have questions after, I can go into more detail. But the interesting thing here, what I later learned was we kind of went very quickly over one of the most important steps, which is what questions are you going to ask? Because the right answers to the wrong questions waste everybody's time. And it's really hard to know, like, are we asking the right questions? And how do we come up with questions? Is anyone here really good at writing technical interview questions? Just like fast, high quality questions? Because we're hiring, so please come talk to me afterwards. No, we do have a team of content developers, as we call it. And it's quite hard. So we figured out at Carat how to make this easier and more efficient, because we need to have hundreds of questions. Okay, so it's also 4 steps. The first step is we're going to work backwards. We're going to start with the competencies. What are the skills and experiences that are going to lead to someone being successful on the job? And especially if you're a hiring manager who's then going to be the engineering manager, you're going to have to give that performance review. So like really, what do you want to see for an excellent performance? Because sometimes job descriptions don't always, you can start with job descriptions, but sometimes they don't always match up. So you start with what success looks like. Then you work backwards. What do you need to assess for this interview? Because sometimes there's things people can learn on the job, or there's things that maybe aren't so important that, what are the things that really should impact a hiring decision? Once you've identified and prioritized those competencies, and competencies are things like maybe having a certain level of expertise with SQL. Is it like at the join level, or is it at a different? Is it at charting? Is it you want to have certain algorithmic understandings and capabilities? Is it familiarity with certain frameworks? Is it strategic thinking or ability to deal with ambiguity? Write them down. Know what you want to evaluate. Then develop questions to assess those competencies. So for a specific competency, what would be the format or questions that would illuminate that? If it's writing great tests, like ask them to write a test suite. If it's debugging, set up a problem for them to debug. Stuff like that. And of course, don't forget that it's not good enough to just have the questions. What are the observable behaviors that you want to see that you're going to be able to measure and evaluate? Like, that's this level of performance. If I see this, this is what it means. If I see that, it means something else. Right? Let's develop the rubric alongside the question. Right? That will fully set up interviewers to succeed from beginning to end. Does that make sense? How do you guys feel? Am I going into enough detail, too much detail? Any burning questions? Cool, perfect. Great, so I was feeling like I knew what I was about. I moved on to another company to lead a couple more teams. I joined Indiegogo, which was maybe there were 40 engineers when I joined. It was a local startup. Great mission. And here's the thing about Indiegogo. So it's a startup, like I said, and it's very hard to compete in the Bay Area, where I was living at the time. Very hard to compete with those big tech companies with huge budgets who are giving all these great compensation and benefits. The thing about startups, the advantage of startups, in addition to yay, mission and ownership and things like that, is that you can hire really quickly. You try to snap up good talent before they've even done the on-site at Netflix or whatever. That's in my experience. The interesting thing about Indiegogo was that the hiring pipeline was really long and had so many gates. There was a recruiter phone screen, then you would do a technical phone screen, then you would do a homework, like a take-home homework problem. And so hopefully you're not interviewing at 10 places and your homework is now your full-time job. Then you come in to do a whiteboard. Then you come in again to do some more technical interviews, and then you come in a last time to meet with the founders. So there's a lot of gates. And on the plus side, this meant that everyone who ended up at Indiegogo really wanted to work there. It was a very passionate crew. And in some ways that's, it's maybe it is a nice filtering function. But as a hiring manager, I just wasn't able to hire quickly enough, and I kept losing candidates, and it became this really big problem. I'm going to go through some of the problems that I encountered there and in general, just to illuminate things. So one, homework challenges. How many people here have like a homework challenge or a take-home test as part of their hiring process? Yeah, and I'm not gonna, sometimes I get it, right? It's, what are some reasons that you do that? Like scale is mostly it, right? Are there any other? Another nice reason is sometimes there might be candidates who really don't like to be in a pressureful whiteboard situation, and they're like, I would rather do this take-home challenge. So that's like in level 2, the second level class, more advanced class, we could, hopefully you'll learn some things from this that'll help you make better homework challenges, but I'm just gonna go through some of the problems with homeworks to watch out for. So they're not all bad, they can be part of a pipeline, but you gotta be really beware of certain things. One is cheating. They're a lot easier to cheat when you're doing stuff at home than when you're in person. And the problem with that is that can mean that when you're bringing people on site, you tend to have more false positives. So you're spending more time on site with your engineers who would rather be writing code and developing features than interviewing necessarily. And it's demoralizing when you see too many false positives. It makes, it just makes you kind of unhappy and skeptical, and I don't think it's very great. The other thing it can lead to is a leaky pipeline if it's required for everybody. Especially with like tests in the US in particular, I know that we have some standardized tests that have just been shown to be biased and very problematic for certain folks with different backgrounds. And it can make people, for a variety of reasons, not like tests and just, oh, there's a test, I'm gonna go over here. And so we definitely see that we aren't seeing all of the candidates we wanna see because of that. Also, senior candidates or candidates with families are just like, I don't have time for this. Also, I have a very long and awesome career that I would love to talk with you about, but I don't wanna like prove it. So you kinda can miss out. And the other thing is that sometimes with these challenges, and with interviewing in general, you can have an ambiguous expectations and an ambiguous bar. The ambiguous expectations tends to hit especially when there's no one to talk to, right? Like you get this assignment and you're confused, but like what can you do about it? Or you have this time test and there's no one clarifying things for you. You can also see it on the interviewer side. If at Indiegogo, our challenge was, it takes 3 hours. You don't need to spend more time. But we were definitely getting candidates spending like 10 to 20 hours writing extensive documentation and analysis and like this really comprehensive test suite. And we couldn't help but be like, we want to hire those people. Like that's our bar now. And someone else, just because they didn't put in the extra time, they didn't think, they thought maybe that was against the rules, we just said no to. It wasn't that maybe they could have done a nice job. They just didn't. So that's a problem. And just to hit on this further, it's not just related to whether it's a homework challenge or a test or even an interview. If you have one candidate and there's 2 evaluations that are different, that's a problem, right? That's a signal that something wrong is going on. That's why interview reviews, again, can be very valuable. Here's one way it shows up. Say you have an interviewer interviews a candidate and says, we had this lovely conversation, the candidate analyzed different approaches, and they almost, they wrote a solution, ran out of time, but got most of it. It was great. I think we should hire this person. Someone else interviews that same candidate or witnesses that same performance and says, can't believe how much time this candidate wasted. We are a results-oriented company. They didn't even finish the problem. That's a big problem. They didn't even write tests. How can we hire a professional engineer who doesn't write tests? I don't know which one of these is correct, right? The problem is just that they're different for the same candidate. It shouldn't matter which interviewer is in the room when you're assessing someone. So one of the important things, the third lesson here, my lessons 3 and 4 are all about how to set the candidate up to succeed. And so being clear is going to be really helpful with that. And I know that sounds obvious on the face of it, but it's pretty complicated in interviews to not, we don't want to judge candidates on what they don't do. So for the testing case, if we don't ask someone to write tests, we don't know if they can't write tests or if they just thought, they're just trying to follow along. Like candidates are pretty disempowered in an interview situation. They're trying to follow along with what someone else is doing. The interviewer has to guide the interaction. Just trust me that candidates get told all sorts of weird pieces of advice. I've heard it all. And it's not that they're bad engineers, it's that interviewing is a different skill that they may or may not have been coached for in a great way. And so if you want to know how well someone tests something, you just ask, like, write a test suite. What's a test suite you would build to show confidence that your code works? And they'll either do a great job or or not, and then you can assess that. Even things like ability to deal with ambiguity. Like we might say, hey, that's really valuable on the job. Of course, on the job, you have all sorts of context and relationships, and I'm a little suspect of trying to evaluate something that complicated in a 1 hour high stress situation with a stranger. But let's say you really did want to evaluate that, tell the candidate. We're going to assess how you deal with ambiguity, so I'm going to give you a vague problem to work through, and you can ask me questions, and then see how they do with that. So be open about what behavior you are assessing. And the important thing is to assess and evaluate one thing at a time. So even when we ask candidates to write code, and we're like, yeah, you need to get a working solution, and also it needs to be most optimal and very well designed, like orderly code that's easy to maintain. Now the candidate is trying to do 3 things at once, and they probably don't have a lot of time to do it in. And they might make their own decision, well, I think good code design is really important, so I'm going to spend some time on that. I'm going to make some nice classes and use some good design patterns. And which could be fine, but as the interviewer, if at the end you're like, wow, they didn't finish this question, and that's something that's very easy to evaluate, whereas partial credit can be a little bit more biased and difficult. If the candidate is making a decision that actually doesn't put them in the best light, they've just biased the interview unknowingly. Really all you've assessed is that they weren't able to read your mind, which as a manager, I would love to hire people who could read my mind, way less meetings. I just never seem to be able to meet my hiring goals. So, if you're gonna assess problem solving instead of mind reading, maybe break things up, design an algorithm for this problem and assess algorithm building. And then, okay, even if they don't say they couldn't come up with an algorithm, give them an algorithm to implement rather than trying to assess implementation skills alongside multiple things. I mean, it really depends on what you're trying to assess and where your bar is. But think about evaluating one thing at a time, not multiple things. You don't want candidate decision to bias the interview. The same with multi-part questions. If you're asking like a part 2 to a question that depends on part 1, and if the solution to part 1, if there's 2 solutions and one of those solutions is a lot easier to deal with when they get to the second question, but they don't know the second question at first, that's another gotcha. The candidate choice is just put themselves in a weird place that they didn't know about. So interviewer bias and candidate bias essentially are both things to watch out for. All right, so here's another problem. Are you, or maybe you know someone who's a great engineer who's sometimes bombs interviews? You guys are pretty great. Good for you. But seriously, do you think that, how often do you think engineers bomb interviews? Like that they're actually pretty good, but they underperform in an interview situation? Is that like, okay, what's that? Constantly? Yeah. Other thoughts? There's no right answer. I don't know the answer on this, actually. Okay, I'm just guessing based on my experience that it happens. And the reason I know it happens is because sometimes we get to interview someone many times with, say, very difficult questions, and they show that they're really good at answering all these difficult questions in different interviews with different interviewers. And then, oh, that's odd. What happened there? Maybe they just weren't familiar with that, or they were a bit rusty at that moment, or they just got choked up and forgot something. And in this case, would you say that this was like a senior engineering level that they were passing and then they failed that one? Does that mean that they're 80% senior? It probably doesn't, right? Say someone bombs an interview and then aces the next one. It's are they 50%? We're not the average. I don't think that's how technical performance works. I think basically that if you choke, it's just, whoops, that happened, more or less, right? Because with a technical assessment, the problem is these false negatives. Right? The problem with behavioral interviews is false positives. And someone might be very confident describing an architecture that their coworker built. So hence the technical assessment where you might ask someone to design a system or something like that, right? And then it's very difficult to confidence your way into knowing that algorithm or knowing how databases work or something. But the false negative becomes a lot more of a danger. So one of the things that helps with this is candidate experience. that, oh, and I guess one thing I should say, at Carat, we do offer these just no questions asked redos. So if a candidate just thinks, I messed up, I want to do this again, we're like, great, do it again, 1 hour. It's worth it for a company to hire someone who's going to be there for a great employee for 4 years or whatever. But if every time a candidate did a redo and they were doing a lot better, we'd be really worried about the consistency of our interviews. So luckily that doesn't happen. Usually things don't change that much, but sometimes they do and people get great jobs. And that really helps, if you are missing your false negatives, those missed opportunities can be very expensive because you have to keep hiring and putting time and money into it. So you don't want that. Redos are nice, but they're sort of this cheat code that's not like the solution, right? They're just the backup plan. So you want every interview to be really high quality. You want the candidate to do their best so that you are making really efficient decisions. And candidate experience, it helps with a lot of things. Candidates, even if they're not hired, they're gonna tell their friends. They might say things on Twitter and Glassdoor, and you really want those things to be nice. Also, interviewers do better, in my experience, if interviewers have the skill to communicate with lots of different candidates in lots of different situations. I think that makes interviewers less biased and able to separate what is the interaction from, from like what are the competencies we're trying to assess. Of course, it enables candidates to do their best, and these conversations change lives. I do a lot of work with students and some practice interviews, and for students where technical interviews it's like their first, like their Carat practice might be their first technical interview. It makes a big difference when they discover that it's not this scary, mean, stressful situation that they were expecting. And for a lot of early career candidates, they're gonna have to do a lot of interviews and apply to a lot of places. So you want people to, get in there and not give up. Even when a candidate isn't doing so well, you want it to go great. And of course, if it's someone you really want to hire, you're selling to them as well. So we do anonymous surveys at the end of all our interviews. 95% of our candidates rate the experience as positive, which I think is very surprising because most candidates are not getting the thing they really want. Somehow they're unhappy but still happy. So something that's good to strive for. And this can, reducing false negatives and also false positives can lead to better on-site to offer ratios. Okay, so the last tip is to reduce noise by using encouragement. I'm going to talk about hints in a little bit, but hints are not encouragement. Hints are we'll get to hints later. Should have brought it up now. Spoiler. Encouragement is the thing you do for free to make people feel good and to do their best. Not everyone needs it. It doesn't matter if they do, it's just noise. So by encouragement, I mean, even body language. Like sometimes when someone is new to interviewing or they've been interrupted and your mind is on this bug you were trying to fix, sometimes we can just sort of be like uncomfortable and giving signs that even if it's not related to the candidate, but they're like, it's harder to connect. It could be just, even, I don't know, inappropriate silence, just like, not giving some amount of validation, like, yep, you're on the right track, stuff like that. What we want to do is, be friendly and warm. And what I like to say is that with interviewing, it's kind of like, I like to imagine I'm Terry Gross. I don't know if that's, nope. Like a journalist interviewing, a celebrity, and you're just trying to find out all their deep, dark secrets, right? You want them to open up. So, you're just being really warm and trying to figure everything out. You don't want to be skeptical, right? If you're skeptical, that can be intimidating and such. But just because you're being all nice and curious, it doesn't mean that you're not being a judgy in your head, right? Like you still don't want to judge a book by its cover, right? You want to still be analytical, asking those follow-up questions, be skeptical inside, just not outside. Okay, pro tip, at the end of working at all these companies and being very passionate about interviewing and hiring, I came to the conclusion that volunteerism is not enough. There's only so much you can do when performance reviews are based on completely other things. And everyone is essentially volunteering their time. So I found Carat, and I was delighted to discover that there's this place where people put all their time and energy into making technical interviews better. I became an interview engineer myself. This was a lovely for me, part-time job. If anyone is interested in interviewing in addition to being an engineer, we're also hiring for those positions. It's quite wonderful. I couldn't get away from my love of startups and middle management, so I later joined Carat as a full-time employee as the director of interviewing to grow our interviewer community alongside my team and to figure out like how do we interview interviewers and how do we onboard and improve quality and alignment and all of those types of things. This past year I moved into research and development, figuring out new interview formats and questions, and I give talks like these at conferences and also special engagements with our clients, so with the engineers at client companies. And we still have about 20 minutes left, which is good, because I want to give you one more little tip. This is one of the sort of future of interviewing things that we're working on in R&D. So I brought up intentional communication, and I hinted at hints. Here's the thing, when you're interviewing someone, everything you say or do is going to fall into one of these categories of communication. Okay, we've covered being clear, we've covered being encouraging. I want to talk about hints. Hints are a thing that doesn't happen in other interviews outside of engineering. Like when people are like, tell me about your last job, like there's no hints that I can give that candidate about their life. But we do that in skill assessments. And here's why, right? Over time, we're trying to maximize signal. So the candidate is not stuck, they're solving the problem, great, I'm finding out more about them. And it might be bad signal, it might be, wow, they really can't do this that well. It's still signal, that's good. That's my job. Okay, candidate gets stuck, signal flatlines. And if, say they get stuck for half an hour, like that's a waste of a lot of time in the interview, right? So hence, hints have become this thing that we do, right? Interviewer gives a hint, gives away the answer. The signal drops because we don't know what the candidate can do at this point, we just know we've told them something. But the hope is that we'll rebuild the signal elsewhere. We've just saved us some time to go explore some other capability. That's the theory. Is it working for anyone here? Because it's not working for me. Like if I have to really tell someone a hint and tell them how to answer the problem, they've kind of like failed the interview, is usually how it goes. It's also one of the things that is very hard to do consistently, to know when to give a hint. Is this candidate stuck? Are they just not confident? That sort of thing. There's a lot of bias, and it's hard to really align interviewers on it. It's also sometimes not great for candidates. Let me share, I talked earlier about assess one competency at a time, but I didn't really talk about how do you assess a competency when often, like in tech, these are deep skills. Like there's a spectrum. It's not just like you know it or you don't. A lot of times it's like how senior is someone? Sometimes you're trying to assess that, right? And so often what we'll do is we'll ask a question that's fairly straightforward. And then if they get it right, we'll like ask a harder question. And if they get that wrong, great, we've just discovered where they are. They're in between those 2 points. And this is based on the assumption that if you know something really well, you get it right, like most of the time, very quickly. If you don't know something, you get it wrong very quickly. There's a little bit of a gray area and inconsistency in the middle, which we'll just hand wave away. The problem with this, there's a couple problems with this. I want to build on this. I think this is a good model for how to discover competency. But one is it's a pretty big window. Like if you only have time to ask 2 questions, you're gonna have a window somewhere. Is it when someone is struggling with that second question? Is it maybe we kind of waste our time on these questions and we don't know how to categorize our really advanced candidates? It's also pretty inefficient, especially when we say, yeah, we're letting candidates, even with hints, maybe struggle for like half an hour. Here's the thing, okay, at Carat, we have a lot of data. Within the first 10 minutes of candidates solving a coding question, we most of the time know what the ultimate recommendation is going to be. It's not like it's not like 98%. It's like 60%. So there's a lot of false negatives and false positives that are keeping us from having a 10-minute interview. But you can kind of tell as an interviewer. Sometimes you do kind of get a sense up front, and so there's a diminishing returns as the minutes fly by. And also, I think there's a poor candidate experience to either spending like a whole interview struggling with one question, especially if their buddies or the recruiter said, hey, you gotta pass 3 questions. You gotta get through 3 questions to pass this. Candidates then start freaking out when they get a little stumped in the first one, and then it's a downward spiral, right? That's not great. The reverse isn't great either. That candidate thinks, oh, I solved this question. I got some help from the interviewer, which is really nice. I love that, and I aced this interview. And then they're really disappointed when they don't get the job. So there's a little bit of a balance here. And so the future, I think, just to optimize this problem, we're engineers. We want to optimize things. We ask candidates to do that all the time. Adaptive interviews, where we ask more questions, and it's sort of the search problem to narrow in on where someone is at. And maybe even by limiting, having time limits where we move through questions a little bit faster. So for example, we might have this space of questions mapped out, and so when a candidate, answers, this, a level, say there's like levels 1, 2, 3, sort of like levels of competency. They answer a level 3 question, they get it wrong, let's move back to a level 2 question. Instead of giving a hint, then we just don't know where they are. Are they level 1, 2, or 3? No idea. Let's just move back to a level 2. Can they solve that? Yes, okay, we're starting to narrow in on where they are. And we can do the same thing, moving through this tree. And we can make this tree pretty complicated. We can have, skip levels, we can, go back and forth, we can really try to map out an interesting space here. And I'm pretty excited about that because we've just turned a linear search problem into a logarithmic one. So we've just optimized the interview. I think we win this interview talk. No, but more seriously, that's all I have for you today. I'm Lus Mendel. You can find me on LinkedIn and Twitter. You can email me at lus@carat.com. And I'd love to take questions. Thanks for listening. Yes, Adam.
2 questions. How do you evaluate if you hired the right person?
Oh, how do you know if you hired the right person?
Yeah, like after some time.
Like at Carat, or just in general, I would say, how do they do on their next couple performance reviews?
Well, you can give both answers. How do you do it in your company, or how would you advise to do it in a general software company?
Yeah, I mean, I think as a manager, I think that's the measure of success is the person succeeding on performance reviews, assuming you have meaningful performance reviews. At Carat, we don't make hiring decisions, which is actually very freeing. As an interviewer, you're just rooting for the candidate, you're making observations, it kind of changes. It's actually a very cool separation, separate the decision from the observations. We do follow through with particularly, since a lot of our interviews, not all, but a lot of them are first round before an onsite. So we'll see how can we impact the onsite to offer ratio and onsite to accept ratio. So we're just we're trying to get feedback as one step in the process. And we do track ourselves where candidates end up because we often interview them in different ways for different companies, for example. Is my marketing person here? I don't know what I could say, but that's a very difficult question. How to really know if you're truly predictive, especially for false negatives, the invisible ones, the missed opportunities. You tend to know the false positives, and sometimes can what is it called? Like overbuild for that. Any other questions? Yes.
So you mentioned the separating of the hiring decisions from the hiring observations. I was just curious what the rationale for that was and how you found that.
Well, at Carat in particular, it's because we aren't making hiring decisions. We're giving recommendations to. Yeah. Okay.
But I mean, I know some other companies do that as well, and I was just curious if you.
I think it frees you to really be more intentional and consistent with the observations. And, so at Carat we have an algorithm that actually takes these observations and figures out the recommendation for us. And sometimes interviewers are like, that doesn't seem right to me. And that's not oh, let's change it, but that's okay, let's look at what's happening and if this is information that we can use to improve our processes. But even when I was doing this manually as an engineering manager, I mean, those are different steps. You have specific interviews that are trying to assess specific competencies, ideally based on observations, just to try to make it consistent and grounded. And then separately, you're usually making a hiring decision based on multiple interviews. And that is already a separate kind of algorithm. or at least it's an algorithm based on separate competencies. And so even if an interviewer might be, in our interviews we assess like how well the candidate communicates and their coding style and lots of different factors, but they're not all weighted the same. You're gonna always have an algorithm that's figuring out like, but what is really important, what can they learn on the job? So maybe it's less about whether separation is the right thing, but just being very intentional. I think it's helpful though. It was definitely this aha moment when I became an interviewer. I was like, whoa, I've never done this not as like a hiring manager who was also constantly like judging things. Any other questions? Yeah.
You said on redos, the candidate usually isn't successful the second time either. Do you have an approximate number like on that?
Claire.
I think it's about 33% improve their score.
33% improve their score. What does that mean to you? What does that like?
I'm not just curious about just about as like a metric for what kind of signal you're getting from the first time around.
Yeah, I mean also candidates self-select. And one thing I suspect is that simply knowing that you have another chance, that it's not all or nothing, I think relaxes some percent of candidates to then not need the redo. It's harder to measure, but yeah.
Well, I was thinking that the number might actually be inflated because of the fact that, like you said,
Yeah.
the candidate who opts for technical and just says, oh, I can do better.
Yeah.
Just, well,
And we're like, great, we want that. It's not cheating. They still have to solve the problem and pass the bar, right? Yeah. There was another question. Look at you first. Roman.
I've got a question. So how do you maybe change your process if you have just one role and multiple candidates?
Sorry, how do we change our process if?
Well, I mean, this is all about evaluating one candidate.
Yes.
But what if you have just one role and multiple people do like?
Oh, I see. You have one role and you've seen multiple candidates and now you're trying to decide?
You just take the first one or
Okay.
everyone positive.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I was a hiring manager, especially for newer roles, I definitely wanted to see multiple people before making a decision, especially if I wasn't like hiring all the time, So at Carat, we don't do that. We treat it all very separately. And we work with our clients to figure out like really what is the hiring bar and what they're looking for a certain role. I don't know, I think it's a nice practice to look at multiple things, and that can help you then develop essentially the rubric. I mean, if you have a nice rubric, like if you know what you need, if you know what success looks like, you probably don't need to compare so much, but it's like an iterative process sometimes to develop that. The one thing I would say to watch out for is this idea of this like rising bar, like that I kind of mentioned with, well, we've seen this candidate here that's amazing, and now our new bar is this amazing candidate. We saw that with interview reviews because we kept getting our most senior like interviewers who were becoming mentors to like train the next batch, and they were the most like consistent and conscientious and expert engineers and interviewers. And so we were like, why does the bar keep raising? Like we think this person actually would be a great interviewer. What's happening? And also that slide around, we also sometimes see this with clients in a rising bar where they do maybe like, just to make this extreme, if you're doing like 7 technical assessments and a candidate passes 6 and misses 1, it's like, they probably just choked. Also, you probably didn't need 7 to tell you that. So I think in general, if you can have a variety of try to assess a variety of skills and then sort of put that together to build sort of diverse teams that, this person's gonna keep us honest about technical debt and this person's gonna make sure we like meet deadlines. Sometimes people kind of fill in nice ways. Yes?
You talk about homework. That maybe it's difficult to assess all the time. What's the optimal length that you suggest for an interview? How many stages you?
Oh, how many stages?
Yeah.
I think that depends on what your hiring metrics and needs are and how much time you can invest in things. So I don't have a specific answer.
Some candidates they put off because they see that the stage is too long.
Yes.
Maybe the process is too long. Do you have feedback about that?
There's two things here. One is having different processes that you deem fairly equivalent to cater to candidates who want different things, which is maybe twice as much work, but maybe that you miss less. There's also like, what if a candidate says, I've got another offer, I really want to work for you, but like I need to know in 3 days, and you're like, oh my gosh, like how are we going to schedule all of this? good luck. Like maybe talk amongst yourselves after class. Yeah, I don't know. I think that it's tough. I deal more so with the specific, like, let's go through what your specific pipeline is, what your metrics and goals are, and how can we sort of tweak things. Everything's a trade-off. I'm an engineer at heart. Yeah. Over here?
What do you think about trial days, like doing exercise on site instead of doing it like as a homework or something like that?
Exercises on site instead of homeworks? Yeah, I think,
Including the candidate in the, like, a full day of engineering work. for example.
yes. And then do you have a second question, or is that it?
No, but
No, that's it? Yeah, that. I mean, look, here's the goal. The goal is to spend as little time as possible assessing the most, skills and competencies and making a hiring decision really efficiently, like just at scale. And that's what we're trying to do with Carat, and I think we have a solution, that can do that in very specific ways. So in some ways, like less is more. But it depends on what how much you can invest and what you need. I mean, at Indiegogo, for example, we did move away from homework into candidates coming on to do like a 3-hour like pair programming session. But that really is only possible with candidates who have that sort of time and interest. Like here's the thing, there is no right answer. It really just depends on but what are the competencies that you have prioritized? And then is this question and process optimized? Sorry, I feel like now I'm just not giving answers. Is there any other question that doesn't want me to give you a general tip? Yes.
What are some of the most common biases that you have seen?
Ooh, common biases from interviewers. Okay, one is detecting so a lot of it has to do with the encouragement clarity hint situation. So detecting when a candidate is stuck versus just like basically giving hints too soon, when ramping up and being clear would be better, or giving encouragement at first. One thing that can happen is we like to do a project conversation before the coding, and largely to set the candidate at ease. It's like they're remembering, I did really well at this thing. I approached this challenge really nicely, and I've built some rapport. And it's like a 5-minute conversation, and then we write some code. And just when I was interviewing, often I'd have that conversation and be like, oh, this person's going to be great, or oh, this person's going to this is going to be over their head, and the other thing would happen in coding. So don't judge a book by its cover. Any biases that you found, or sort of any challenges? Yeah.
Interviewing techniques, which one I should avoid?
I mean, here's the thing. If you don't have this explicit write-up form and explicit guidelines, I think the general bias is that people just think, they just come with whatever they think are the important competencies. And so you get someone who's like, they didn't write tests, they did write tests, they, thought too slowly, they didn't use Java. You just get random things from our own experiences about what it means to be a good developer. Cool. Yes?
In your data collection, do you have track categories of questions, by what kind of algorithm or data structure?
Oh, yes.
And do you have any trends of which areas give the best signal? Or arguably better signal than others?
Yes, hash maps. No, I'm just kidding. Although I do think when I talk with candidates, I'm like, please learn these. They'll save you in so many ways. Well, what we track, so we track very specific competencies, even at the level of data structures and algorithms, say, for coding questions. And what we do look at, so when we're evaluating question performance, we'll plot, we'll sort of plot what are all the performances, so say we have a set of candidates that have all done the same question, or the same competency through different questions. What does that performance curve look like? And what do we expect that to look like? And maybe our ideal is that it's like a high filter function for the low, for candidates with low competency in that thing. There's a lot of candidates that are getting that score because we want to filter out that, say. And then we have this nice curve, and by the time we get to the candidates that we're really interested in, it's the filter is quite low, so we're getting clusters of candidates that are small sizes, right? So we have a very granular evaluation. I don't know if my hands are doing the trick here, but what we look for basically is what we can see sometimes there's funny, things are bimodal. If like we were trying to assess algorithms and like, why did this regex competency like come in here? Like we didn't care about that, and now we've just candidates that happen to know about using split instead of spending 10 minutes writing a regular expression or like jumping ahead, and we're getting weird clustering, so we get like these weird graphs, these weird inflection points. We basically are just learning what is noise in our questions, and we try to remove that. That's the level of analysis that we've mostly done so far. In terms of specific skills, it's like, yeah, for the machine learning role, it's like we ask those questions, and then for DevOps, it's a different set. We just try to match that.
All right, so the flip side of that is, if there's any specific thing that's notorious for false negatives, because sometimes, for instance, some places will like ban dynamic programming questions.
Oh, right. Yeah, I mean, I think we want to separate, like, what level of, like, is algorithmic knowledge, familiarity, or even that level of problem solving, like, is that a proxy for something? Like, are you actually trying to assess problem solving? Oh, I need to stop. But yeah, what's a proxy versus what's real can sometimes be a thing. All right, thanks guys. Thanks for coming to this talk.